Hi, Mark Granis here with Lecture 11.4 on the Fallacies of Presumption, the last lecture in our text, The Reasonable Person. Today we're going to begin with a brief recap of the fallacies of relevance. We learned 3 families of those. And then we will learn our final family of informal fallacies, the fallacies of presumption. There are 6 of these, and I usually take this lecture in 2 parts to cover all 6, so I'm going to go through a little faster than normal because we're out of time for the year. And I will cover all 6 in one brief survey. So let's get started. We began this chapter with the fallacies of relevance, defects in reasoning that introduce an irrelevant basis for affirming or denying a proposition under consideration. We noted that we want to learn these fallacies of relevance in subfamilies, and we discovered that there were 3 of these that we could keep pretty clearly apart. The ad fontem fallacies are distinguished by the fact that they focus on the source of the argument. So the problem is relevance, but the distinguishing feature is that they all look to the source of the argument. The ad hominem, the tu quoque, the genetic fallacy, and the questionable authority appeal. Those are all the ad fontem fallacies. Then we talked about the emotive fallacies. These are also fallacies of relevance, but their distinguishing trait is that they try primarily to elicit an emotional response instead of making a logical argument. So we talked about the appeal to fear, the appeal to shame, the appeal to pity, and then also the appeal to 2 different kinds of opinion, the popular opinion and elite opinion. All of those emotive fallacies. Third, we learned about fallacies of misdirection. These are fallacies of relevance that occur when someone affirms or denies a proposition other than one on which the question under consideration depends. In other words, something that sends the argument down the wrong path. That's the idea of misdirection. And here we learned about the non sequitur, the red herring, and the straw man fallacy. So all of these are fallacies of relevance, and along with the fallacies of clarity, we consider them informal fallacies because they depend, at least in part, upon the matter of the argument and not just its form. Today, with our last family of fallacies, we're going to leave the fallacies of relevance because the fallacies of presumption are different from that. They're defects in reasoning that occur when someone tries to affirm or deny a proposition by shifting or reducing the burden of persuasion instead of offering reasons. So there are 2 new concepts here that we need to define. One is the idea of a presumption, and we can define a presumption as the provisional acceptance of a proposition without proof. A lot of people are not very clear on the difference between a presumption and an assumption. An assumption is something that you usually make, say, for purposes of argument. You can treat a presumption or an assumption as something that you assume indefinitely, whereas a presumption is something that takes the prefix pre seriously. It's something you do before you've heard any proof, and which is definitely subject to disproof in almost all cases, subject to being disconfirmed, in which case you change your presumption. You maybe rebut the presumption. The second concept that we need is the burden of persuasion. And we can think of the burden of persuasion as the responsibility for offering reasons. In other words, if no one offered any reasons at all, what would you assume about this matter? That would be your presumption. And the burden of persuasion would be on the person who would want to change your mind about that. So we can see that these 2 concepts are linked, and they typically work together, as they do, for example, with our presumption of innocence in the courtroom. We presume that the person who's being charged with a crime is innocent, not because we think he actually is, but because we want to make the guilt be proven and entitle everyone to a presumption of innocence until the government proves that he's done something wrong. It's not only in courtrooms, though, that we use presumptions. We use them all the time. We use them in planning for our future. Every day that you get up, you make a variety of plans, and you assume that the day will go more or less the way other days have gone in the past. Even if it's a special day, you think that everything else, apart from the special thing, is likely to be ordinary. And in fact, that's rarely true. Usually by the end of our day, we can point to some things that didn't go exactly the way that we thought that they might have, some new things that happen, some surprising things that happen. And that's the way life is. We use presumptions in our social interactions. Every time you meet a new person, let us say a stranger or something like that, you have in your head an idea of what this new person is probably likely to be like most of the people you've met in the past. But that's not always true. Sometimes we meet someone who's very unusual, not like anyone we've met in the past. So whenever we use these presumptions, we know we might be wrong, but we have a pre-existing idea, and we act on that idea subject to disconfirmation in the future. All right, then. So what are the 6 different kinds of presumption or fallacy of presumption that we want to talk about here? The first is the argumentum ad ignorantiam, or argument from ignorance. This is the fallacy of presumption in which someone tries to sustain a conclusion based on an absence of contrary evidence. For example, the Loch Ness Monster does exist because no one has ever proven that she doesn't. Or the Loch Ness Monster doesn't exist because no one has ever proven that she does. The fact that we can do this in both directions, that we can use this shift in presumption either to try and sustain the conclusion that the Loch Ness Monster does exist or that she doesn't exist, is pretty revealing about how exactly this fallacy works. The fact is, we don't know anything one way or the other about the Loch Ness Monster. We don't have any evidence one way or the other. And so if you're arguing about it, all you're arguing about is the presumption. And the key phrase to remember here, just like we learned a little while back, that correlation is not the same as causation. Here's another phrase that you should tuck away. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. When we're just shifting burdens of persuasion back and forth, shifting presumptions back and forth, doesn't actually expand our knowledge. To expand our knowledge, we actually need to make some observations, do some reasoning, do something that counts as genuine knowledge rather than just burden shifting. Still, presumptions are useful, right? We don't want to say that it's always a mistake to use a presumption. We use them all the time. What is the mistake is the unjustified pretense of knowledge, right? That's where the fallacy resides. So if we're going to use burdens and presumptions, where should we put the burden of persuasion? That depends on a number of things. It's often said that you can't prove a negative, and some negatives can be proven pretty easily, but non-existence, for example, would be a very hard negative to prove. So it would make sense, in the case of the Loch Ness Monster, to presume that there is no Loch Ness Monster unless someone comes up with hard evidence that she exists. Sometimes the practical consequences of mistake might lead us to put the burden one place or another. Arguably, that's what we do with the presumption of innocence, right? We hold that it's worse to put an innocent man in jail than to let a guilty man go free, and that's one reason why we assign the presumption where we do. I've used the example in the text also of, always treat every gun as loaded. Assume every gun is loaded. Okay, yeah, that's a good rule of household safety, but it might not be the right rule if you are a sheriff going out for a one-on-one gunfight at the OK Corral or something like that. You probably want to make sure that your gun is actually loaded. Okay, so that is the argumentum ad ignorantium, or the argument from ignorance, where we just don't know anything at all, and so we want to seize the victory and say, oh, because no one knows anything, I win. That is a fallacy. Our next fallacy we can deal with pretty quickly. It's the post hoc fallacy, and this is the fallacy of presumption in which someone tries to sustain a causal conclusion based solely on the sequence of events. For example, the rooster crows and then the sun rises, therefore the rooster must be causing the sunrise. Now, you can see that this is ridiculous. What you should notice here is that this is not a matter of two people shifting a burden of persuasion back and forth between them. This is a matter of reducing the burden of persuasion. This is trying to place a thumb on the scales in favor of some event in the narrative being the cause, and really all you've done is place it in a narrative framework, right? So you haven't really added any knowledge, you've simply told a story. And the problem with that is that you can't presume that you have told the right story or identified the right event. There is a precursor of your favorite team winning. It is probably hard work, practice, talent, good coaching, the right weather. I mean, whatever, there will be things. It's probably not your lucky socks. So the problem with the post hoc fallacy is not that we can never use chronology to help us identify causation. It's that you can never be sure you're telling the right story in the chronology. So that is the problem there. Here's another one that has to do with time, the chronological prejudice. This is the fallacy of presumption, in which someone tries to sustain a conclusion based solely on one of two presumptions, either the presumption that old is better than new, or the presumption that new is better than old. So, for example, if you said the novels of Danielle Steele are better than the plays of William Shakespeare because they are more recent, then you'd be indulging in the second branch of this fallacy. If you said that the economics of Karl Marx is far superior to the economics of Friedrich Hayek because it's older, then you would be indulging in the first branch of the fallacy. There is typically a political valence to this fallacy, or to which sort of it you might be more inclined to. Generally speaking, conservatives are people who tend to think that old is better than new, that whatever has stood the test of time deserves some deference, and that it should be continued unless someone gives very good reasons for displacing it. And generally, it's people of a progressive mindset who commit the second branch, or at least are more inclined to commit the second branch of this fallacy. They want the newest thinking on an idea. They don't want to be bound by what the past said. They don't believe that the past has any claims on us, that we have to use our reason and do the best thinking that we can afresh. And both of these arguments have some claims on us, and both of them can help correct our thinking in any given case. I don't want to give you the impression that this is all, that we can divide people according to which of these fallacies they commit. In my experience, people of all political persuasions will use either type of chronological prejudice as it suits them. But usually you should maybe think about both. But that is chronological prejudice. Okay, let's move on to the black or white fallacy. This is the fallacy of presumption, in which someone tries to sustain a conclusion by falsely restricting the consideration of alternatives. This is also known as the false dichotomy fallacy or the false dilemma, and it is constantly used in the two-party system by Republican and Democratic political campaigns. You've got to vote for either Smith or Jones, and Smith is terrible, so Jones is the only choice you have. Or you've got to vote for either Smith or Jones, and Jones is absolutely insane, so you've got to vote for Smith. Once you narrow the range of alternatives to only two, then if the two choices are both bad, you can be pushed towards some pretty bad conclusions simply by pointing out that the other one is, if not worse, at least intolerable, right? I like the terminology of the black or white fallacy rather than any of the other names that I've suggested here, because I think it helps us imagine three different animals that illustrate the reason why this is fallacious and why it misrepresents the real world in some regards. The first type of animal is the zebra. So if you think about asking, is a zebra black or white? Well, it's both, right? And there are lots of things in reality that often partake of elements of each of the things that someone is trying to force us into in a false dichotomy, right? Zebras are both black and white. You can't answer the question correctly by choosing one. Similarly, elephants, right? Elephants, not a mixture of black and white as the zebras are, but rather gray all over. And sometimes things in the real world are gray. They're not pure examples of either extreme. And so when someone uses a black or white fallacy to push you toward one of two extremes, they're forgetting about the existence of elephants. And then finally, swans. Swans famously used to be thought by Europeans anyway to be all white. Every swan for hundreds of years that everyone saw was white. Millions of swans probably had been inspected, and people thought swans were white. And then when the Dutch got to Australia, they said, they have black swans there. So sometimes the world is so complicated that something we think, even for centuries, is absolutely universally true, we eventually find is subject to disconfirmation, and we find that there's an exception. So we have to be open to that kind of possibility. Always remember zebras, elephants, and swans when someone is trying to force you into a black or white choice. Okay, what's next? The slippery slope fallacy. The slippery slope fallacy is the fallacy of presumption in which someone affirms or denies proposition A on the ground that it will inevitably lead to B, C, D, and so on until it reaches its logical extreme E. So the usual way this is deployed is to say that if E would be wrong, then A must be wrong as well, because between A and E there's just no stopping place. Alternatively, you can argue that E must be right, because it's only a bit beyond D, and D is only a bit beyond C, C is only a bit beyond B, and B is only a bit beyond A, right? So you can use this, in a sense, either offensively or defensively. The key presumption here is the presumption of slipperiness. That is, that there's no stopping point between A and E where you could draw a sensible line that you might then be able to adhere to. So how do we know when it's slippery enough, right? How do we know when this is a fallacy? It's when that presumption of slipperiness is evidently false, right? It's I think the example that I give in the text, or at least one of the examples I give in the text, is about speed limits. Well, we can understand, for example, that we don't give a ticket for 36 miles per hour in a 35 mile per hour zone. We can explain that as a matter of uncertainty about our measuring. We can explain it as a matter of a certain amount of grace or leeway for people who are slightly inattentive, didn't know that their speed was creeping up that way. And still, we can say that at a certain point, you neither of those excuses is plausible. Maybe that point is 40, maybe that point is 45. Certainly by the time we get to 60 miles an hour in a 35 mile per hour zone, then we're not worried about measurement techniques, and we're not worried about someone who's not trying to speed, someone who is trying to be cautious and simply let the car coast downhill a little too fast or something like that. So when the slope isn't that slippery, that's when treating all of the points on the slope as if they were one and the same is fallacious. What is our last fallacy of presumption? It is begging the question. And the begging the question fallacy, widely misunderstood, is the fallacy of presumption in which someone tries to affirm or deny a conclusion based on premises that already presuppose that the conclusion is true. That is, the premises already contain the conclusion, may be disguised a little bit, and so therefore you're not really demonstrating it. So to understand this, we have to first say, well, what is the question? The question is the question under consideration. That's usually and ultimately the conclusion of the argument. But there could be lots of intermediate questions. There could be a question about whether one of the premises is true. So it's not only the conclusion, but it is the thing that we're talking about. It's the point that the proponent of the argument needs to establish. Well, how is that question begged? What does begging mean? Well, to beg the question is to get it without earning it. In other words, someone who asks you to accept premises that already presuppose the conclusion of the argument is not earning the point, not making you smarter from premise to conclusion, but simply moving terms around in such a way that once he has gotten your assent to the premise, he has also now got the conclusion thrown in free, so to speak. Sometimes the circularity is pretty obvious, but at other times you have to look for it. For example, if we say, well, why do triangles have three sides? Well, because they're three-sided polygons. Obviously, what we've done here is we've defined the triangle as a three-sided polygon, and now we know that if we ask how many sides do they have, or do they have three sides, then the answer is yes, triangles have three sides. That was already in the premise of the argument. But if we say, well, why does opium make us sleep? Well, this is a serious question that an example that's been used many times since. People used to say, well, opium makes us sleep because it has a dormitive power. Oh, really? A dormitive power? What does that mean? Well, it means it makes you sleep. And now, I don't want to say that this is not any advance in knowledge. I suppose there's something here that says, well, it's intrinsic to the opium. What's intrinsic to the opium? Well, it's intrinsic to the opium that it makes us sleep. In other words, we're just going around in circles here when we say that the reason opium makes us sleep is because it has a dormitive power. One thing to note, when I owe this to one of my greatest and best teachers for harping on this fact, begging the question does not mean raising the question. So when you say the injury to the starting quarterback begs the question of who's going to start next week, no, it doesn't. That's not begging the question. That's just raising a question. Begging the question means treating a conclusion as established by premises, building the conclusion into the premises in such a way that no real advance in knowledge takes place from premises to conclusion. All right, that was a quick jaunt through the fallacies of presumption, and that's it for Chapter 11.